After relatively quick draw in Game 2, we return to the 2024 World Championship match in Game 3. At this point, Ting was leading by 1 point. In this game, Gukesh again had the white pieces, and we will be looking at the game from white's point of view. But you are welcome to look at it from black's point of view. Throughout the game, we will go through variations, then return to the game, so please wait for the cues before moving the pieces. Use the app as a guide when moving throughout the variations to set up the pieces correctly. If you haven't done so yet, go ahead and set up all the pieces and let's get started. Gukesh opens with d4. So he deviates from game 1 where he started with d4, but at this level the players aren't just d4 or e4 players, everyone plays everything, so it's no surprise that he came prepared to the World Championship with both e4 and d4. Ting responds with knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, and e6. So we have the Queen's Gambit declined, and Gukesh chooses to play the exchange variation. He captures on d5, and recaptures.
Ich glaube, das ist so ein bisschen eher um Verwicklung zu verhindern, dass irgendwann noch c4 genommen wird.
And black plays c6. Now we have the Carlsbad structure, which is a common structure that comes from Queen's Gambit declined positions and also some Nimzo positions. One main idea white has here is to play rook b1, followed by pushing the b2 pawn to b5, and asking black how the c6 pawn is going to react.
Das heißt, dieser Minoritätsangriff, der sich da nimmt?
Black has more pawns on the queen side, and white is attacking with the minority.
Das ist so typisch und so erklärt er das, finde ich sehr schön so.
Was ich immer so schrecklich finde, ist bei diesen YouTube-Videos, wenn das dann aufs Deutsche übersetzt wird.
Okay, man muss natürlich gut Englisch können. Die versuchen das auch in andere Sprachen zu übersetzen schon, aber Deutsch haben sie noch nicht im Angebot.
So whenever we put our pawns on one color square, the bishop of that color, if it gets stuck behind the chain, becomes a problem. So even though the diagonal of the bishop is open, it doesn't really have a promising square to go to. So black plays g6. With the idea of playing bishop f5.
Der Vorteil ist natürlich, man spricht ja wenig Englisch und dadurch lernt man auch besser Englisch zu sprechen.
Auf jeden Fall.
Wolltest du auf der Arbeit welche schwule, wie sie Deutsch konnten? Ich nichts können in Deutsch. Do you speak English?
The game is to play g4 and challenge the bishop that will soon land on f5. So black plays bishop f5. And now queen to b3.
Die Stimme kommt mir irgendwie bekannt vor.
Wie eine Ente?
In this Queen Gambit decline position, whenever the c8 bishop moves, white can play this Queen
b3 and heißt. Ich meine, ich habe die irgendwo schon mal was kommentieren gehört.
And it's not always such an easy task.
Und hierfür sind die Farben zum Beispiel ganz hilfreich, weil das, was sie erzählt, kommt ja immer mit den Farben, wird das dann verdeutlicht.
Der Springer kann dahin und b7 könnte hin.
White doesn't want to trade on b6 because the trade would simply allow the rook on the a8 to become a good piece. The file will open, the rook will activate from its starting position without even having to move, and then black would start pushing pawns b5, b4 and kicking the c3 knight away. So instead white plays pawn to g4. So now we see the idea behind h3. He wanted to kick away this bishop. Ting decides to trade queens after thinking for about 15 minutes. White recaptures, of course. And now there's a critical moment in the game because black needs to decide what to do with the bishop. Going to e6 would have been a very solid choice and a very reasonable square for the bishop, but instead he plays bishop to c2.
Ich finde aber, man versteht es, aber es ist ja kein super kompliziertes Englisch. Es ist auch nicht so komischer Ami-Dialekt, dass man nicht versteht.
He has the double pawns, and for black to take advantage of this double pawns and of this pawn weaknesses, he needs to find a way to attack them. So immediately he's putting pressure on this b3 pawn and asking white what he's going to do and how he's going to defend this pawn. So knight d2 is of course possible, but white doesn't want to play a move like this in this position because then the c1 bishop is blocked and the knight on d2 is also a passive piece. Instead he plays bishop to f4.
Das kann man aber alles gut verstehen.
So in the game, H5
dass der Springer nicht den Läufer blockieren will, dass er schwach ist und sowas alles, das versteht man alles.
So capturing the pawn immediately would have been a mistake because now the bishop is going to find itself in a very tough situation after knight d2. The bishop has two options, either c4 or c2. So going to c2 is a mistake because the bishop will actually get trapped. Let's see how. So let's play bishop to c2.
Kommt eine Variante.
White plays rook to c1. Now bishop has only one square to go to, which is e4.
Kommt der F3 oder wie?
But after f3, the bishop is actually trapped and is going to be forced to give up this bishop.
Also das geht wirklich richtig gut hier. Das ist ja wie persönlicher Trainer, das ja quasi.
Ja, deshalb so, jetzt müssen wir alles wieder zurück.
The other option is to play bishop to c4.
Das ist auch eine Variante.
And from here the bishop has a few squares to go to, such as b5 or a6. So in this position white will capture the bishop. Black recaptures. And simply play e3. Next, white is going to capture the pawn on c4 and going to enjoy a really nice advantage due to the bishop pair and more space.
Da sagen kann man die Analysen ja
sehen. Die liefern das regelmäßig. Es wird jede Woche kommt was Neues.
White is simply going to capture this pawn.
Ach, wegen Läufer G2.
And recapturing the knight is a huge mistake. Because after bishop g2, the rook on a8 is actually trapped. And black is going to have to give up a lot of material.
Das ist so der Vorteil von diesen ChessUp oder ChessNut-Sachen. Sowas bietet Millennium alles nicht. Ja, ne? So, jetzt müssen wir alles wieder zurück machen.
Also jetzt hat er. Achso, da vorne ist ja das Brett. Wir lesen kann ich kleinen Vorteil.
So. Ein Läufer, ein Bauernweißer war da noch.
Ach, den er geschlagen hat.
Und dann war hier noch Springer. Der da, Springer, so, ne?
So capturing this pawn is not ideal, and this is going to be a case for the next few moves because black had the chance to do this for several moves that we're going to see, but in a very similar position. Instead, he plays h5.
Haben Sie im Hygieneunterricht uns immer gesagt, wenn Sie husten müssen, dann.
Now the g4 pawn is hanging, so white plays rook to g1. The reason he plays rook to g1 is because he really wants to maintain this pawn on g4. White has this idea of trapping this bishop on c2. So if we give white a couple of moves, the knight will go to d2, the rook will go to c1, and we will find this bishop in a similar position that we saw. The bishop will simply get trapped. So now black actually has to start thinking of ways to make sure that the bishop goes home. Black captures on g4. White recaptures.
Hat sie erklärt, warum man den wieder nicht nehmen kann, weil wieder der Läufer gefangen ist.
And after a 30-minute think plays knight b to d7. So again, it's possible to play bishop b3, but it would be very similar to the position that we saw a few moves ago, except that the pawns on g4 have been traded, and maybe we can argue that it's a better version for black because the h-file is open and the rook is more active, but the long-term problems are still there. The space and the fact that white will have the two bishops, and white will maintain the two bishop advantage for a very long time. So instead, knight b d7 is played. And now knight to d2. This was Gukesh's long think in the game. He spent about 15 minutes. So we're going to see what we saw in game 1 as far as time management goes, because in game 1 Ding also got really low on time, and the same thing is starting to happen here. And at this point he was already 53 minutes behind the clock. And if I haven't mentioned already, there was no increment in the first time control, which means the players didn't get 30 seconds after each move, so they had 2 hours to make 40 moves. White has a very serious threat of rook c1 and trapping this bishop, so black has to find some concrete ways of making sure the bishop has a way to go home and isn't stuck on c2. Ding plays rook to g8. The idea behind rook g8 is to go g5, opening up the diagonal. So the bishop has the g6 and h7 squares. And in this position, Gukesh decides to play g5.
Da kommt jetzt zuvor.
which was a very interesting decision because it kind of goes against everything he had been doing so far. Because so far what white is trying to do is maintain this pawn on g4 to make sure the f5 square is no longer available to the bishop and to try to trap this bishop. But by playing g5 he just gives up this square. But he did have another idea in mind. The knight moves to h5. The knight moved away with a tempo. The bishop goes to h2. The rook goes back to h8. The rook goes back on the open file. White plays f3. So Gukesh here is pretty determined to trap this bishop. He wants to go e4 and stop the path of the bishop up to f5 and make sure the bishop is stuck on c2. So once again, black is facing some serious issues and has to find ways to make sure that the bishop doesn't actually get stuck on c2. Positionally, things have significantly improved for black because now the bishop has a place to go to. It can go to f5. The bishop doesn't have to get stuck on c2. But on the downside, thing is now down to 30 minutes on the clock against Gukesh's hour and 24 minutes. So he had 30 minutes to make 23 moves, which comes to a little over a minute per move, which is not enough time when they get down to critical moments. And Gukesh had about an hour more than his opponent on the clock. Of course, there's the possibility of thinking during your opponent's time, but it's not the same, because you have to also think about what your opponent is thinking about and try to guess their next move. Whereas when you're thinking on your own time, you're just thinking about what you're going to do, and not have to count all of your opponent's possibilities. So Ding plays knight to g7, attacking the bishop on h2. The bishop goes to g3. And we have reached the critical moment, and now we're going to see how having less time on the clock is going to really hurt Ding in this game. In the game he played rook to h5, but he has several other options. So one of them was simply going back to f5 with the bishop. And after e4, so white is still trying to grab some space in the center. The bishop goes to e6. White takes on d5. Black doesn't want to take with the pawn because then the knight jumps to b5, threatening knight to c7. Instead he can take with the bishop. White takes back. So white does get the bishop pair in this position, but at the same time he does have a lot of pawn weaknesses. The weaknesses of the double pawns on b2 and b3. Reaching these pawns is going to be far more difficult because there is no direct way to attack these pawns. But the pawn on d4 is also weak, so after the knight goes to e6, it will attack this pawn and also the pawn on g5. So this was definitely a reasonable way for black to play. Let's go back to the position after bishop g3.
Springer. Springer. Ja, nee, Quatsch. So. Bauer. Da war noch ein Bauer. Jo.
Another move for black here would have been bishop to e7. This is a line that Ding showed in a press conference after the game. So the idea is to take on g5 and attack this d2 knight. If black manages to capture this d2 knight, then the pawn on b3 will fall and the bishop will live. So white will play immediately rook to c1. Bishop goes to f5. So this is very similar to the bishop f5 line that we saw. e4. Bishop slides back. Capture on d5. Bishop captures. Knight captures. Pawn captures. Rook goes to c7. Knight to e6.
Was ich so gut daran finde, ist irgendwie habe ich Probleme, solche Partien am Bildschirm nachzuspielen. Weil das fließt irgendwie durch einen durch. Und weil sie das gewohnt am Brett zu machen.
Genau.
Man hat da damals so im Buch da gesessen und Brett irgendwie mit dem Bildschirm.
Das bringt viel mehr, definitiv.
Ich finde, da bleibt weniger haften. Wenn ich manche Leute sehe, 15 Minuten nach Zeit, weil 20.000 Partien, aber ich bin 20.000 Partien hängen geblieben.
Push is to stop the bishop from going to b5 and pinning this d7 knight. And black has a lot of good play for the pawn that he has sacrificed, and even though the rook on b7 is so active, it's also in some kind of a precarious position, because if the king goes to d8 and c8, we can imagine this rook just getting trapped. So both players agreed that this was a reasonable way to continue, but this is not what happened to the game. So let's go to the position after bishop g3.
Wenn Schwarz dran wäre, wird der Großrock hier einen Turm fangen.
Ja. Ja, noch einer da, ne? Aber wie gesagt, der mit dem König 2 laufen, dann hat er schon kein Feld mehr, ne? So, wieder zurück das Ganze.
So,
Bauer. Bauer.
Geht das mit diesem Selbstjahr nicht auch?
Mit was?
Hier mit dem da drüben? Dass er dann quasi seine Figuren selber wieder aufbauen würde?
Ja, der kann das. Der wird das selber machen, ne? Da stand einer, da stand der Turm. So.
And this was Ding's big mistake. He played rook to h5. Ding is relying on some very direct calculation to give up his bishop and get some pawns in return, but there was a huge mistake in his calculation down the line, which we will see. So white plays e4.
Ist das die Partie, wo Schwarz irgendwann die Figur gibt für 2 Bauern?
Ja.
Weil das kommt alles irgendwie ein bisschen bekannt vor.
So now the bishop is actually trapped, rook c1 is coming, so black has to find some very direct and dynamic ways of making sure that the bishop either stays alive, or if the bishop falls, that he will get a lot of counterplay or at least a lot of pawns. Ding's next inaccuracy came immediately as he took on e4, but he should have played knight e6 instead. So let's see what would have happened if the knight goes to e6. And we will see why this was a better move, because we can compare it to what happened in the game. Keeping the pawn on f3 would have been better for black, because there are some tactics involving with giving up a knight on f3. So rook c1, knight takes to d4. So now temporarily the knight is defending the bishop, so white plays bishop to f2. White attacks the defender. Black plays bishop to g7. The position is very dynamic, because if we take on d4, the bishop takes back on d4 and our rook on g1 hangs. So of course white is not going to do this. So white has a very nice quiet move here in this position, rook to g2. The idea of rook to g2 is now white wants to take on d4, and after taking on d4, we will take on c2, because our rook on g1 will no longer be hanging. So basically what white is saying is that there is no way for this bishop on c2 to escape, so he can take his time in order to get this bishop. So at this point, black has to give up a piece and try to get as many pawns as possible, because this bishop is falling. So taking on b3 with the bishop doesn't help, because after taking on d4, the knight will take, and taking on b3 with the knight also doesn't work, because we simply take on c2. So knight can take on f3. White takes back. The bishop takes on e4. Knight captures. Pawn captures. Knight goes back to d2, attacking the e4 pawn. There is no good way of defending this pawn, but black can capture on b2. Rook goes up to c2.
Das mit den Farbenspielen scheint dir Spaß zu machen, ne?
And now knight takes on e4. Black has 3 pawns here, and if we just go by the value of the pieces, we know that a minor piece is equal 3 pawns, but there's still a lot of pieces on the board, and white does have the bishop pair, so white still has very good chances of trying to win here. But still, this is a much better version than what happened in the game. And we can see why that is as we go through the game. Let's go to the position after white played e4.
So, Kommando zurück.
So immediately going knight e6 would have been the better move, but instead Ding took on e4 with the pawn. White retakes with the pawn. Still rook c1 is there, and now he plays knight to e6. So now there is no pawn on f3 for white, so these ideas of sacrificing the knight on f3 and are not in the air anymore. So rook goes to c1. Knight takes on d4. Bishop goes to f2. Bishop to g7. So we saw this position with the pawns on d5 and f3, and this was Ding's calculation, and what he calculated in this position was rook to g2, similar to what we saw, and his idea was to play bishop to b3, and after white captures the defender on d4, bishop recaptures, recapture on b3. Now black has an excellent move of bishop to e3. With a double attack and capturing on g5. So black will have 3 pawns in this situation for the piece, but this is a better version than what we saw before because we have opposite colored bishops, which gives black better chances to make a draw. However, this is not what happened in the game as white found a better move. So let's go back to the position after bishop g7.
Ja. Kommt er jetzt auch, sagt er gerade.
Das war so seine Idee quasi.
Ding hat Gukesh fand eine bessere Version. Zack, so Läufer da rein. Bauer noch da.
Gukesh found an excellent move in this position.
Redet auch erst weiter, wenn man es aufgebaut hat, merkst du?
And this was the move that Ding missed in his calculation, and this is a huge problem for black, as now the bishop is not going to survive anymore. So if we can visualize the position where black could have played knight e6 immediately, which means there would be a pawn on d5 for black and a pawn on f3 for white, this would have been a much better version, and knight e2 would have actually not worked for white, because black would have captured the pawn on f3, then captured the pawn on e4 and gotten a lot of pawns for the piece, have a really nice healthy pawn chain, also attack this pawn on b2 at the end, but because the pawn is no longer there, this is not going to work out really well for him anymore. So instead he decides to take on b3 with the knight.
Ach, das hat er die Figur gegeben, dass sie keinen Sinn hatte.
Rook takes on c2. And now knight takes d2. So this capture gives white an opportunity to make a mistake. There are 2 ways to recapture the knight, either with the king or with the rook. Capturing with the king was the correct way, and that's what was played in the game, but let's see what would happen if rook takes d2. Now the knight goes to e5. And this is a very annoying move because knight f3 is a huge threat, working the 2 rooks and the king, as well as knight c4, trying to capture the pawn on b2. So if knight d4, then black will play c5, kicking away the knight. The knight doesn't want to move because it will allow knight f3 check, so white can throw in bishop e2. The bishop attacks the rook while simultaneously covering the f3 square, but black is happy to give up the rook for 2 pieces. So she takes d4, takes the rook, pawn retakes.
Ich hätte beide schon eher gedacht, Springer b5.
Black would be thrilled to get this position where he has 2 pawns for the exchange, an excellent knight on e5, a great bishop on g7, and a rook that will soon join the game. So of course this is not what Gukesh wanted, so he did not go for this. So let's go back to the position after knight d2.
Das ist allein schön, wie die Hintergründe dann immer erläutern, ne? Tok, Turm dahin. Wo ist ein Turm? Da. So, was haben wir noch? Der war weg.
Läufer haben wir noch.
Da muss noch der weiße Läufer, aber hier habe ich ihn.
King takes on d2.
Ja, König nimmt. Hat er gemacht.
Da guckt man damals so von Träumen von sowas.
Perhaps this seemed like the less natural move, but the king is headed to e3. We are after all in the endgame, so he wants to activate his king. The knight goes to e5. Knight goes to d4. Rook to d8.
Und jetzt kann er nicht mit c5 den wegtreten.
With the simple threat of knight f3, and the king goes to e2. I like this move because it doesn't walk into any kind of checks with the knight. Potentially, the king defends the bishop from here, covers the f3 square, and everything is safe in the position. Black plays rook to h2. Bishop goes to g2. a6. And now b3. I really like this move for several reasons. One of them is white is stopping the knight from ever going to c4, so it controls the knight. And another reason is black has a dark squared bishop, but not a light squared bishop. So he puts his pawn on a light square, where it cannot be attacked. So this is a very safe move, a very quiet move, safe move, thinking about the future, thinking about potential threats that black can make, or any kind of counterplay that black can come up with, and stopping it from a long time ago. Black plays rook to d7. And now Gukesh plays another nice move. The rook goes back to c1. This is another move that I really like, and another sign of very good technique. White is connecting the rooks. At some point, white is going to play rook to d1 and challenge the rook on d7, but he is in no rush. He has a great position, he's up material, he's simply improving his pieces one by one before he is ready to start offering exchanges and trying to convert the extra material that he has. Black plays king to e7, rook goes to d1, and now king back to e8. What black's last two moves tell us is that he doesn't have any other ways of improving his position. The problem for black is that he has 2 pawns for the piece, which is not enough, so objectively his position is bad. But he has also placed all his pieces on their ideal squares. Usually when we put all of our pieces on their ideal squares, at that point we're looking for ways to strike. But at the very least, we're looking at keeping the position the same and saying, okay, there's also nothing much my opponent can do, and then we just go back and forth and perhaps the game ends in a draw. But when we put all of our pieces on their best squares and there is no path forward, that means there's something really bad in the position. And the problem in this position is that he is down material, and at some point white is going to find a way to get through this nice structure that he has. Gukesh kicks away the rook by playing bishop to g3. The rook goes to h5. And now knight f3. White is starting to execute his plan, he's starting to exchange some pieces, and after he successfully exchanges some pieces, he's going to start attacking black's pawns. So black took on f3, and now king takes. In the game, bishop d4 was played, but let's see what happens if rook takes on g5. White gave up another pawn, but the problem is going to be the weakness of the king. So we take on d7. King takes. Check from d1. The king cannot go to e8 because bishop h4, and the rook cannot move because of rook d8 mate. So king has to go to e6.
Das kommt mir auch nur bekannt vor, dieses.
But now bishop h3 check.
Das ist wunderschön.
Now king doesn't have any squares to go to. e7 and f6 run into bishop h4, so f5 is forced. And now white has a great move here, rook e1. The point being, he wants to take on f5 with a double check and try to win some extra material. The problem for black is that the rook on g5, even though it looks like an active piece, is actually kind of in trouble because potentially it can get trapped. So for example, if black king tries to run away to f7, we can take on f5, pawn retakes, king goes forward to f4, rook to h5, and now takes on f5. Even though more material has been traded and white only has 1 pawn left, the issue for black is that their pieces have really activated and the 2 bishops are now too active. Next, the rook will go to d1, d7 and start picking up this pawn. Not to mention that this king is in a lot of trouble and it looks like it's almost in a mating net. So this position is quite hopeless for black. Let's go back to the game after move 34, after king f3.
Bauer noch. So. Turm noch.
Müsstest du da stehen haben?
Da, ja. So, und der stand hier. Ne, der stand Bauer noch.
Instead, bishop d4 was played. Rook went to h1. Black captured on g5. And now bishop h3. And now we're really going to see the problem with these bishops coming to life because the rooks are starting to run out of squares. Already the rook cannot go either to e7 or d8 because of bishop h4, and one of the rooks will fall on the diagonal. In the game, f5 was played, bishop f4, then played rook to h5, and he actually ran out of time before he managed to hit the clock, which means he lost the game. But the game is objectively lost anyways because Gukesh has this really nice resource of bishop f5.
Auf G6 sollte mit Schach zu nehmen.
The pawn cannot capture the bishop because the rook is hanging, and if he captures the rook on h1, instead of capturing the rook on h1 immediately, white has this nice intermezzo of capturing on d7 with check. The king recaptures, and now capturing on h1 and staying up a full piece. Overall, this was a really good game by Gukesh, who showed his grit and showed that he is able to recover after a really tough loss in game 1, where he lost with the white pieces, and play a game where he could keep things under control and most importantly control his nerves and keep his cool. At this point, the match is tied 1.5 to 1.5 with 11 more games to go.
So, hat dir das so gefallen? Ich zeige dir jetzt nur mal, wenn du hier mal im Schnellverfahren durchguckst, da sind nicht nur Partien. Du kannst hier anklicken, was du sehen willst, welche Klasse, und die haben also zig Ausbildungsvideos da, zig. Da kommen jede Woche 2 hinzu. Ja, und das ist durchaus, also ich finde das sehr lehrreich. Ne? Also das ist eine feine...
Das ist eine Möglichkeit, da kannst du damit davon träumen.
Ja, ne? Das ist eine feine Sache. Auch Endspielsachen sind da für Anfänger. Du kannst also einstellen, was du sehen willst. Ne? Und ist eigentlich optimal, finde ich.
Das ist nicht schlecht.
So, das war der.